You're sitting in Sunday school. The teacher is telling the story of Lazarus. She describes the tomb, the stone rolled away, the grave cloths. Jesus calls, "Lazarus, come forth." And he walks out, alive. A miracle. You raise your hand. What did he say? The teacher pauses. What do you mean? Lazarus, after he came back. What did he say about where he'd been? She smiles. The Bible doesn't tell us that, sweetie. But it's a wonderful miracle, isn't it? You nod, but the question sits with you. Years later, you're reading the Gospel of John, chapter 11. You reach verse 44. Lazarus comes out of the tomb, and then nothing. No testimony, no account. Just, the chief priests wanted to kill him because he was drawing crowds. You close the book. The question from Sunday school is still there, louder now. If Lazarus came back from 4 days of death, why didn't they let him speak? My name is Nathan. Some of you know the story by now. 12 years teaching history at a Catholic school in Indiana. Resigned in my early 40s when the questions I was asking made the administration uncomfortable. Now I do this. The Lazarus question didn't come to me in a classroom. It came through something I didn't expect. My childhood Sunday school classmate Claire. We lost touch after confirmation. Reconnected decades later when she moved back to Indiana. She'd become a hospice nurse. 23 years, sitting with people at the end. We met for coffee last year. The conversation turned the way it always does when I talk to people from my past, to my research. I mentioned I was working on a video about Lazarus. Claire put her cup down. She said, "I need to tell you something. I've sat with dozens of people who came back from clinical death. They all have something to say. Terror, peace, confusion, light, darkness. They come back changed, and they talk about it. That's human. So when I read that Lazarus 4 days gone says nothing, that's not divine mystery, Nathan. That's censorship." I couldn't stop thinking about that. Something about it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. A man who came back from the dead, 4 days gone, body decomposing, and when he emerged, the gospel gave him 0 words, not 1 sentence. That silence isn't an accident. Let me show you what's not in the Bible. John, chapter 11. Jesus receives word that Lazarus is sick. Verse 6. When he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days, 2 full days. He waits. Why? When he finally arrives, verse 17. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. 4 days. Martha even says it explicitly in verse 39. Lord, by this time there is a stench, for he has been dead 4 days. Decomposition. No ambiguity. Jewish tradition at the time held that the spirit hovered near the body for 3 days. After 3 days, decomposition began. The soul departed. Death became irreversible. Jesus arrives on the 4th day. Past the point of doubt. Past the point of natural return. Scholars say the delay was to demonstrate undeniable death, to show Jesus had power over death itself, not just illness. But here's what nobody talks about. The delay also meant Lazarus was gone long enough to experience something. He wasn't hovering between life and death. He wasn't sleeping. Jewish witnesses would have confirmed decomposition. The man was dead. Fully dead. For 4 days. And then Jesus called him back. And then the gospel refuses to let him tell us what he saw. You've heard this story your whole life. Lazarus raised from the dead. The greatest miracle. But you never noticed he doesn't get to speak. The miracle happened to him, not through him. He's a prop in someone else's story. You raise someone from 4 days of death, past decomposition, past the Jewish belief that the soul has departed, and you don't record a single word he said about where he'd been? That's not reverence. That's control. Now here's what stopped me completely when I first confirmed it. The church has an official position on this silence. In 2014, the Southern Baptist Convention passed a resolution. The title, On the Sufficiency of Scripture Regarding the Afterlife. It explicitly notes that people raised from the dead in the Bible, including Lazarus, were given no report of their experience in the afterlife. And then it explains why. Quote, "In God's perfect revelatory wisdom, He has not given us any report of their individual experience in the afterlife." Read that again. God's perfect revelatory wisdom. They have a resolution, an official theological position explaining why Lazarus didn't speak. That means it was a problem big enough to require an answer. When I found this, I sat at my desk for 20 minutes just staring at the screen. My stomach was in knots. They're admitting the silence was intentional. They're saying God deliberately withheld testimony from the one person who could have told us what death was actually like. Why would God need to withhold that? Unless what Lazarus would have said was incompatible with the theology they were building. Here's where it gets stranger. The silence isn't just in the canonical Bible. There's a tradition the Western Church erased. Eastern Orthodox Christianity preserves a detail about Lazarus that you were never told. According to the Church Fathers, Lazarus never smiled again after his resurrection. He was sullen, changed, haunted by what he'd seen while his soul was in Hades for 4 days. This tradition appears in early Christian writings. It was part of the Eastern Orthodox understanding of the Lazarus story for centuries. The Western Church dropped it. Why? Because a traumatized witness raises questions, a triumphant miracle doesn't. A man who comes back from death smiling, grateful, testifying to the glory of heaven? That's a useful story. A man who comes back sullen, silent, haunted by what he saw? That's a problem. So the West erased the detail, kept the miracle, removed the trauma. And most people in the West have never heard that Lazarus was changed by what he experienced. You were given the sanitized version. The version that doesn't ask uncomfortable questions. If you've always felt something was missing from this story, you weren't imagining it. Let me show you something even harder to explain away. Jesus weeps. John chapter 11 verse 35, the shortest verse in the Bible. Jesus wept. Every Sunday school lesson I ever sat through presented this as grief. Jesus loved Lazarus. He's mourning the death of his friend. But the Greek tells a different story. The word used in verse 33 is embrimaomai. It doesn't mean sadness, it means snorting like a horse. A sound of anger, frustration, indignation. Jesus wasn't sad. He was furious. The scholarly consensus documented in commentaries by Raymond Brown and other Johannine scholars is that Jesus was angry at death itself, at the power death holds over people, at the grief it inflicts. But here's what I couldn't stop thinking about when I read this. What if Jesus was angry at what Lazarus was about to experience? He knew what was coming. He knew he was about to pull Lazarus back from wherever he'd been for 4 days. And maybe, for just a moment, Jesus understood what that would cost him. Because Lazarus came back changed, sullen, never smiling again, haunted. Jesus wept. And then he did it anyway. He called Lazarus back. And the man he loved came back damaged. That's not the Jesus you were taught in Sunday school, but it's the Jesus the text shows you when you read the Greek. Bart Ehrman, one of the most respected historical critical scholars of the New Testament, has written extensively about the Gospel of John. His conclusion, shared by most academic New Testament scholars, John is significantly ahistorical. The Lazarus miracle in Ehrman's reading is a theological construction. It's the climactic 7th sign in John's Gospel. It's positioned to trigger Jesus' arrest and crucifixion. It's a narrative pivot, not a witness account. Raymond Brown, in his Anchor Bible commentary on John, reached a similar conclusion. The raising of Lazarus is theology in the form of a story. It's designed to demonstrate Jesus' identity as the resurrection and the life. It's not a verifiable historical event. I'm not telling you this to dismantle your faith. I'm telling you this because the function of the story matters. If the Lazarus miracle is a theological narrative, then the silence makes perfect sense. The story needed the miracle. It didn't need the witness, because a witness who speaks might contradict the point the story was designed to make. So they gave us the resurrection, and they took away the testimony. J.J. Benítez spent 40 years investigating the historical Jesus. He traveled to Israel more than 15 times. He combed the archaeological records, the rabbinical literature, the geography, the Josephus texts. In his Caballo de Troya series, Benítez presents a theory that's impossible to verify but disturbingly logical. He suggests that Lazarus did speak to Jesus privately. And what he said was so disturbing, so incompatible with the message the early church was building, that it was never recorded. The silence isn't divine wisdom, it's editorial control. Benítez never claims this as historical fact. He presents it as investigative fiction, but the logic of his reconstruction matches what we know about how early Christian texts were shaped. The Gospels weren't written by eyewitnesses. They were written decades after the events they describe. They were written by communities with theological agendas. They were edited, copied, and transmitted through layers of scribal decisions. And at every layer, someone made choices about what to include and what to leave out. Lazarus's testimony was left out, not because it didn't exist, because it was too dangerous to keep. Open the Gospel of John right now. Chapter 11. Read it yourself. Count the verses, count the words. Lazarus is pulled from decomposition. The text describes the miracle in extraordinary detail. The stone, the grave cloths, the voice of Jesus calling him out. And then Lazarus emerges, and the text gives him zero testimony. Verse 45. Many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did, believed in him. Verse 46. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. The crowd reacts. The Pharisees conspire. The narrative moves forward. Lazarus says nothing. Ask yourself, is that God's wisdom? Or is that the early church deciding what you're allowed to know? Claire's words stayed with me. I've sat with dozens of people who came back from clinical death. They all have something to say. That's human. When you come back from the edge, you talk about it. You process it. You try to make sense of what happened to you. Lazarus came back from 4 days of death, past decomposition, past the point where Jewish witnesses believed the soul had departed. And he said nothing. Not because there was nothing to say, because what he would have said contradicted the theology they were building. The silence isn't because Lazarus had no testimony. The silence is because his testimony was censored. The question you asked in Sunday school is the question the church never wanted you to ask as an adult. What did Lazarus see? The answer isn't in the Bible. It was never going to be in the Bible. Because the moment Lazarus spoke, the moment he described what death was actually like, the institutional story would lose control of the narrative. A living witness who contradicts the theology is more dangerous than any heretic. So they gave us the miracle, and they silenced the witness, the greatest resurrection before Christ himself, the man who was dead for 4 days, the friend Jesus loved enough to weep over, and we don't get to hear a single word he said. That's not an accident. That's not divine mystery. That's 2,000 years of institutional control over what you're allowed to know about life, death, and what comes after. The silence is the story. And now you know why they needed it. You decide what to do with that.